Welcome back to the exam preparation video series for DP-300 Administrating Microsoft Azure SQL Solutions. I'm Sarah Said, a Microsoft Technical Trainer. This is the fifth and the last episode in this series. In this episode, we'll focus on planning and configuring a high availability and disaster recovery environment. We will cover how to plan a high availability and disaster recovery strategy for database solutions, plan and perform backup and restore of a database, and configure high availability and disaster recovery for database solutions. Here's a list of all the different skills you may be tested on. These are sometimes referred to as the may include, meaning they may or may not be on your exam. This list isn't exhaustive, and while we won't be covering every skill in this video, be sure you can perform these skills before taking the exam. For the DP-300 exam, make sure you know how to choose the right high availability and disaster recovery solution based on your RPOs and your RTOs. The key strategies to know in Azure are availability sets, which have no automatic failover, requires manual recovery, availability zones, better RPOs and RTOs than availability set, but still within a single region. And lastly, Azure Site Recovery, which is best for disaster recovery across different regions. So knowing when to use availability sets versus zones versus Azure Site Recovery is crucial for those disaster recovery scenarios. For hybrid SQL Server deployments, you also need to understand high availability and disaster recovery options that work across on-prem and Azure environments. So know the key strategies here. We have availability groups, which is great for mission-critical apps and automatic failover support. Log shipping, which is best for disaster recovery scenarios, data losses where data loss is kind of acceptable. And database mirroring, which replaced now by always-on availability groups in SQL Server 2012 plus. So understand when to use availability groups versus log shipping as well. And when you're designing this high availability or disaster recovery strategy in Azure, it's important also to differentiate between solutions at the database level and instance level. Expect exam questions on when to use each option. Know the key differences in those high availability solutions. Availability groups, for example, work at the database level. Failover cluster instances cover the entire instance, including jobs, link servers, and logins. Just know that Azure only DR solutions that are availability groups, backups, and restore with Azure Blob Storage and also Azure Site Recovery. Testing those solutions is crucial to ensure failover works as expected. So you might find in the exam that they present you scenarios where you need to choose the right testing approach, so also be aware of the key testing steps. Another important consideration here is how load balancer comes in and how it has to be properly configured to direct traffic to the failover instance when using SQL Server on an Azure VM. So also be ready to identify the right failover testing approach based on whether the scenario involves an individual VM, a clustered instance, or an availability group. And just be aware of the difference between a test failover, like a non-destructive one, and a planned failover where we're switching to production workloads. You also must know the different backup strategies and when to use those each based on, again, your RPOs and your RTOs. We have different backup options for SQL Server in Azure. We have Azure Backup for SQL VMs. You can do manual backups or automated backups. So some key points here to remember. Azure Backup for SQL VM is more of an agent-based approach and stores those backups in a recovery vault. Automated backups is recommended for managed databases, but requires proper scheduling. And manual backup is also useful, but it's more for custom backup retention policies, but kind of lacks that automation part. Also be familiar with different native tools for performing those backups. You have mainly two methods, Azure Data Studio and Azure CLI. So key exam considerations, Azure Data Studio is kind of the best one for interactive management and quick manual backups. Azure CLI is preferred for automation and scripting. And remember, backpack files are used for exporting databases and can be stored in Azure storage containers. So be prepared also to choose the correct backup method based on your requirements. Same applies for the different ways to actually restore those backups. We also have two primary restoration methods. Again, the Azure Data Studio or Azure CLI. Here, the Studio is useful for manual point-in-time restores, kind of for quick recovery. And Azure CLI is also good for automating database restoration using scripts and stored backups in Azure Blob Storage. Be aware of the different recovery models. We have full, simple, and bulk logged, and their impact on your restore operations. Also be clear on how to restore databases to a point in time in Azure SQL. We have different methods and different capabilities. So know about the portal, CLI, and PowerShell. Know the limitations of Azure CLI. It cannot restore dropped databases. PowerShell is the most versatile tool, as you can see, for restoring and supporting all recovery scenarios. And Azure Portal will give you that simple GUI for most restore needs, making it a bit more user-friendly. For the DP-300 exam, we also need to understand how long-term retention works and when to use it. So key points to remember: LCR is configured per database, not per server. Retention policies can also be set for weekly, monthly, and yearly backups, so be aware that long-term retention does not also replace point-in-time retention. Point-in-time retention is for recent short-term restores, while long-term retention is more for kind of compliance and archiving. For the DP-300 exam, you also need to know how to perform database backups and restores using the T-SQL. We have different key backup set options. We have the copy-only, compression, no compression, and also the encryption, which enables encrypted backups for security, additional security. So know about those as well. For SQL Managed Instance, there are some considerations to remember. These have automated backups, but allow also manual copy-only backups for specific retention needs. Also, a tip for the exam: know when to use copy-only. It does not affect differential backups. Also understand no recovery option, which keeps the database in a restoring state for applying additional backups. In general, be ready for T-SQL syntax questions on backup options and restoring from cloud storage as well. Understand also how SQL Server backups integrate with Azure Storage, providing you a cost-effective, secure, and scalable alternative to your on-prem methods. Know the different authentication requirements and the different backup types. And also recall how to restore from URL using either the SSMS or T-SQL. Another important point is geo-replication. This ensures high availability by creating a readable secondary replica in another region. So just know the different ways to configure active geo-replication. You can do that through the Azure portal or Azure CLI. And there are some important points to remember. Geo-replication is asynchronous, so it's ideal for DR scenarios, but not high availability solution. Failover is manual by default unless auto failover groups are configured. So understand the difference between active geo-replication and auto failover groups. Building on that discussion on active geo-replication, you need to focus also on always-on availability groups. These provide high availability and disaster recovery at the database level. So know the key steps for configuring always-on availability. Be aware that availability groups require SQL Server Enterprise Edition for full functionality, and understand how availability groups integrate with something like Azure Load Balancer for those failover mechanisms. Another important concept here is those failover groups which enable automatic failover for our Azure SQL databases and also our managed instances across the regions for high availability and disaster recovery. So also know the steps on how to configure failover groups through Azure Portal and Azure CLI, and expect scenario-based questions on configuring, monitoring, and troubleshooting failover groups. For this exam, understand also how SQL Server high availability solutions work in Azure. the key differences between those high availability solutions. Again, remember those failover cluster instances require shared storage. They use also a load balancer. Availability groups, replicating those databases independently and uses an internal load balancer. And finally, log shipping, which is not a high availability solution, but rather a disaster recovery method. So last year we have log shipping, and understanding also how log shipping enables disaster recovery by continuously sending those transaction log backups to a secondary database. Remember the ways to configure log shipping. Again, we have SSMS, T-SQL, so don't confuse log shipping with always-on availability groups. Again, log shipping is not a high availability solution, it's more a failover manual. Be aware of log shipping monitoring jobs like the copy, restore, the alert jobs, which help maintain synchronization. After configuring high availability and disaster recovery solutions like the ones that we mentioned, monitoring is also critical to ensure they function correctly. So if you're still seeing failovers due to some transient issues rather than true outages, you can configure your availability group or your FCI monitoring to be more relaxed. So for example, temporarily reduce monitoring sensitivity during maintenance or high activity, and you can just revert back to it afterwards. Also remember, this should be used as just a temporary solution rather than eliminate the likelihood of failure. We still need to figure out what's the actual issue that's going on. Once this monitoring is in place, you need to be also prepared for troubleshooting common high availability disaster recovery issues in our Azure SQL solutions. So know the common Azure deployment errors. For example, you might have naming restrictions for your storage accounts. So try to avoid account name invalid errors. Also look for connectivity issues and other errors as well. So for example, if your connections to Azure SQL Database or managed instance fail, look at misconfigurations in your firewall rules or network security groups. And finally, know the DR and high availability configuration best practices like the ones that you see here. For example, monitoring resource limits, how low CPU or memory can cause unexpected failures. These are all important points for troubleshooting. To recap, in this episode, we discussed how to plan a high availability and disaster recovery strategy for database solutions, plan and perform backup and restore of a database, and configure high availability and disaster recovery for database solutions. Remember, this group accounts for 20 to 25% of the exam, so keep that in mind when preparing for your exam. Thank you for watching DP-300 Administrating Microsoft Azure SQL Solutions Exam Prep video series. We hope that this series helps you understand the skills that you're strong in and areas where you might need to revisit. Remember that understanding these concepts is crucial for your success, so be sure to leverage other exam prep resources like the study guide, practice assessment, and also the exam sandbox. On behalf of us all at Microsoft, good luck to you on your exam. And for more information, you can visit aka.ms/dp300exam.